Or the values, and B as the indices. And there's a predetermined table T, which is a vector in field to the capital N. And what so the prover basically commits to A and B, and somehow the verifier knows what T is. And the prover's claim, so V receives commitment to A, commitment to B, and prover claims for every entry of A, and there are M of them. The ith entry of A is the value at location BI of the table. Now, we can think of the table T as like a static computer memory. Okay. And let's see. Yeah, so we can think of the ith lookup as like this is like performing a read operation into like cell BI of the memory. All right. So this is closely related to memory checking. So let me now explain what memory checking is. So imagine there is a space limited verifier. Now, we actually don't care about space limited verifiers. I'll try to explain why this memory checking procedure we're going to discuss today is useful for like lookup arguments and sparse polynomial commitments momentarily. But the old memory checking paper, this is what they were interested in. So they're like, we got this verifier who has very little space, but the verifier, would like to maintain this memory T of size n, which is like way too big for the verifier to store itself. Okay, so what the verifier in memory checking wants to do is outsource the maintenance of memory to an untrusted prover. Okay, so basically, the prover is going to store, have space n to store the whole memory, and what the verifier is going to do is it's going to issue read requests, one at a time to the prover, and the prover will respond, to each read request with some value. Okay, so like the ith read request will be specified by an index into memory bi, and the prover is going to respond with some value ai, claimed to equal the value sort of stored at cell bi of memory. So let me call that T of bi. Okay, so in this language, like memory checking is clearly like very closely related to lookup arguments. In a lookup argument, just the claim values returned by from each read request, and the read requests are like pre-committed by an untrusted prover, and then the prover like proves that all of the read requests were answered honestly. In the memory checking space, you think of the verifier as just being space limited, and it's issuing these requests like on the fly. So after it's issued 10 requests and gotten 10 responses, it then decides, what index to query for the 11th request. So very, very almost the same setting, but not exactly. And then at the end of the day, after all the read requests are answered, at the end of all the read requests, the verifier has to determine whether the prover answered all of them honestly. So whether indeed AI equals T of BI for all I. Okay. And we're thinking of we want a verifier that's only going to basically store like, I don't know, let's say 2 field elements or something like that. So very, very space limited verifier that still somehow has to make this determination at the end. Okay. Any questions about that? Okay. So this old paper of Blum et al. Gave an algorithm achieving exactly this. And okay, so now I'll try to explain why their algorithm is useful for like lookup arguments and sparse polynomial commitments. Let me start with lookup arguments. Okay. So, we've explained like this memory checking setting is like almost the same as a lookup argument. One key difference, is that, the memory checking work was interested in the space limited verifier. Okay, it turns out the algorithm they give, which lets the verifier be implemented in very small space. So the old Blum et al. Paper, that algorithm, so gave a checking algorithm, for making this determination, where V basically just does something like M plus N multiplications, like field multiplications, more or less. So, they cared about the verifier being small space, let's say end additions. But the algorithm they wound up giving, while achieving small space, also involves the verifier just doing field operations, which means the checking procedure can be implemented, by like a small, just generally very nice, very simple arithmetic circuit, which is exactly the kinds of circuits that snarks like to use. Okay, so like you can get a lookup argument sort of directly from it, as follows. Remember in an index lookup argument, like I said, A and B are committed, and we'll see in this algorithm, the prover commits to some extra non-deterministic advice, which I guess it turns out to just be like M plus N multiplicities or counts or something. And there's like a very, very simple circuit. It's basically just it's more or less just a binary tree of multiplication gates, or 2 binary trees, is written two binary trees of n plus n multiplication gates. I'm skipping like a handful of subtractions or something. And it spits out, like 0 or 1, depending on, it basically just runs the verifier's check in the memory checking procedure. So like the circuit like runs the memory checking verifier's checks to determine, whether indeed AI equals T of BI for all I. And I guess, I guess like the table itself is like also an input to the circuit, but it's like public known to the verifier. Ultimately, you can have a lookup argument that just applies the GKR protocol to the circuit. The end of the GKR protocol, the verifier has to evaluate the multilinear extension of the input to the circuit at some random point, and that can be obtained by evaluating the multilinear extension of T at a random point and A at a random point, and the multilinear extension of B at a random point, and so forth. Which for, as we discussed last week, for a lot of tables, that multilinear extension evaluation for the table can be had by the verifier in like logarithmic time in the table size. Okay, so that is why this memory checking procedure is useful for lookup arguments. Now, as far as sparse polynomial commitments go, let me just sketch this, and then this is basically what we'll talk about next week. So this is a sparse polynomial commitment. I care generally about multilinear polynomials, but if you care, there are some snarks where you like Marlin, where you would actually want to commit to a sparse like bivariate polynomial, or so if you're more comfortable with univariate ones, just think of a sparse polynomial as like very high degree, but most of the coefficients are 0. So say like the degree is, I don't know, like s squared, and the number of coefficients that are non-zero is s. Okay. And so the point of a sparse polynomial commitment scheme is we want like prover costs that grow with s rather than the degree s squared. So we want the cost to the prover to only grow with the number of non-zero coefficients. And basically what the prover can do is commit to just the non-zero coefficients. And that's the commitment. Okay, and then in a polynomial commitment scheme, when the verifier, asks, all right, let me just call the polynomial P. So the committed polynomial is P. When the verifier asks for P of R, the prover, returns the claimed value of P of R, let's call it V, okay, and proves that V is obtained, okay, by running an algorithm that takes as input the non-zero coefficients of P and give it and R and computes P of R. Okay, and this is what we're going to talk about next week. That algorithm basically does if there are s non-zero coefficients, it basically does. I don't want to say this. Let me just say it does like C time. Well, okay, S lookups into each of C memories or lookup tables of size. Okay, let's say like if the like the degree of P is s squared, so let's say s squared, whatever the degree of P is, to the 1 over C. Okay. And like that's basically like all it does, and it multiplies the results together. Uh, roughly something like that. Okay. We'll see the details next week. All right. So basically, proving when the prover goes to prove it correctly, like ran the evaluation procedure on this description of P that's been committed. Okay. Like proving that it correctly ran this algorithm on the, committed value, the non-zero coefficients of P, boils down to like running like C different lookup arguments, C different copies of basic lasso or something. And so in summary, like, sparse polynomial commitment schemes, boil down to the prover correctly, proving it correctly ran like an evaluation algorithm on the committed, the description of the polynomial that's been committed. And that algorithm basically just boils down to doing a bunch of lookups into like a fixed memory, and like those memories are structured, meaning the verifier can evaluate the multilinear extension of the values stored in those memories very quickly. Okay, so that is the context for why we're talking about memory checking today. And with that out of the way, I'm now just going to dive into the Blum et al.'s solution to the memory checking problem. But let me pause here and see if anyone wants to ask any questions. Okay, no questions? Awesome. All right, I'm going to quickly remind you about two different fingerprinting procedures. We've seen them both, but Blum et al. Like use both of them. So it'll help to just have a reminder of them. So the first one is Reed-Solomon fingerprinting, which I present in chapter like 2 of the book, I think, as a like an efficient procedure for equality testing, equality checking. So like here you have Alice and Bob. They have two vectors X and Y. And their goal is to determine whether they're the same vector. Okay, and the way Reed-Solomon fingerprinting works is as follows. So Alice interprets her vector X as a polynomial P sub X. Let me just call it P. So P of, I don't know, let's say Z is, and the X is interpreted as like just the list of coefficients of P. So let's say it's x0 plus x1 times z plus x2 times z squared plus x to the n minus 1 times z to the n minus 1. Okay, so Alice just interprets her input x as the coefficients of a polynomial, and similarly Bob interprets his as the coefficients of a polynomial q. And what Alice does is she just chooses a random field element, sends R and P of R to Bob, who checks whether P of R equals Q of R, and if so, he outputs equal, and if not, he outputs not equal. Okay, so that's Reed-Solomon fingerprinting. And if obviously if X and Y are equal, then P and Q are the same polynomial, and Alice's check will pass. But if if X and Y are not equal, P and Q are not the same polynomial. And since any two degree n minus 1 polynomials can agree on at most like n minus 1 points or something like that, if they're not the same, Alice and Bob's check will reject with overwhelming probability as long as the field is big enough. Okay, and then so the other kind of fingerprinting we actually saw in ARIA. This is called I call it permutation independent fingerprinting. So here, Alice and Bob don't want to determine whether X and Y are the same vector, but they want to determine is X a permutation of Y. So like, do X and Y have the same entries up to ordering? Yeah. Okay. Any questions about that definition? Okay, so in this case, Alice and Bob are still going to interpret, each of their inputs as a degree n minus one polynomial. Where is it? Yeah, but now rather than interpreting the degrees as roots of a degree n minus one polynomial, they'll interpret it as as coefficients. They'll interpret it as roots. So Alice interprets her input x as a polynomial p, in which the entries of x are the roots of p. So that is p is the product from I equals 0 to n minus 1 of like z minus xi. And similarly, Bob interprets his polynomial, his input y as a polynomial q, which is the product of z minus yi. Okay, and now everything else is the same. So, Alice picks r at random from the field, sends r comma p of r to Bob, who Bob checks whether p of r equals q of r. Okay, and what's happening here is if x and y are the same up to permutation, then p and q are the same polynomial because they're two polynomials with the same roots, so they're the same polynomial. Whereas if x and y are not permutations of each other, then these are two polynomials with different roots, so they're not the same polynomial. And everything else is the same as in the Reed-Solomon case. Okay. Questions about that? All right. Okay, so let's keep that in mind, but we're going to forget about fingerprinting for maybe 10 minutes before we use it again. So let me just, let me cover. Okay, here we go. All right, so this Blum et al. Paper. So what they do is the following. So to make the read operations that the memory checking verifier is issuing to the untrusted prover, to make them sort of more easily checkable, okay, they modify the reading procedure. Okay, so no longer will it be the case that like the verifier is going to just repeatedly say, hey, tell me the value stored in cell BI of memory. Okay, so they're going to make actually 3 modifications. So modification 1, okay, is each memory cell will no longer just store a value, but will also be associated, have an associated count. So I'll denote, the count associated with cell J as CJ. And, if the prover's honest, CJ is will be, so CJ is purported to be at all times the number of times that cell J has been read up to this point. Right. So initially all the CJs are 0, but then, when a cell is read, that cell's count gets incremented if the prover's honest anyway. Okay, so be the number of times cell J has been read. Okay, modification 2. Okay, so now like the read operations to a cell are supposed to return not just a value but also a count. Okay, so every time a read operation, a read request returns, the prover returns pair. So this is a value count pair. Let's say, I don't know, AI comma CI. The verifier is going to immediately follow that read with a write operation. Okay, so that is so let's say the read op is to cell BI. So if the verifier says, "Hey, prover, tell me the value and count stored in cell BI," the prover comes back and say, the value count stored in cell BI right now is AI comma CI. The verifier will immediately say, "Okay, thank you. Now I request to overwrite cell BI, okay, with value AI and count CI plus 1. Okay, so that is if that's yeah. Let me the plus 1 is not in the index. It's maybe I'll write it as 1 plus CI to make it like totally unambiguous. Yeah. So what's happening, like if the prover's honest and actually returns the value that is stored at cell BI, what the verifier will do here is it won't actually change the value in that cell. It'll just increment the count, thereby conceptually ensuring that the counts indeed are tracking at all times for each cell the number of times it's been read. Right. So it's incrementing the count to kind of indicate that the cell was just read an additional time, so the count should go up by 1. But of course, if the prover is dishonest and returns a value AI that's not currently stored in that cell, this will have the effect of overwriting the cell with that value. So kind of making the lying prover like kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy I guess in a sense, where if the prover says, "Hey, this particular cell contains this particular value," and it's a lie, well, the verifier sort of makes sure that after that read operation, the cell actually does contain the value the prover said it did, with the count incremented by 1. So also if the prover can lie about these counts as well, right? So if it like returns an overly high count, this will increment the overly high counts by 1 rather than like the real count by 1. So the prover can get the verifier to sort of write, junky stuff into the memory by lying. Okay, and then the final modification is that when all the reads are done, the verifier does one final set of read operations, and these read operations are not followed by a write. So V sends n final read operations, read requests, 1 per memory cell. Okay, so the prover will return the claimed value count pair stored at each memory cell, sort of at the end of all of the read operations, and these final end read operations are not followed by additional write operations. Okay, so those are the 3 modifications. All right. Any questions? Okay. So, I mean, I guess conceptually, these modifications are sort of having the memory, like each memory cell, like track extra information, namely these counts. And then, moreover, are like having the verifier, put in these write operations, which are intended to just keep the counts accurate if the prover's honest. But if the prover's dishonest, the write operations might sort of, start overwriting memory values with the values the prover claim lives there, even though the prover's lying. Okay, so like, if the prover's honest here, like these writes are like very clear what's going on. They're just incrementing the counts as the counts are supposed to be incremented. But if you have a lying prover, then these write operations will start writing like, the prover's lies get written back into memory. All right, so I'm now going to tell you how the verifier's checks work. But in order to do that, I have to introduce 2 vectors. Let me call them R and S. Sorry, R and W. So R stands for like the read vector, and W stands for the write vector. Okay, and each of R and W will wind up having m plus n entries. So R is in field to the n plus n. Sorry, that's not quite right. I'm sorry. Each entry of R and W will be a 3 tuple. So each tuple should be interpreted as like a cell. Let's say bi, a value ai, and a count ci. Okay, and so I guess what they're in are R and W are in like field by field by field to the n plus n, right? Because they're each going to contain n plus n three tuples. So similarly, W is also in field by field by field to the n plus n. Okay. Now let me tell you. So basically, R is going to be like all of the tuples like returned across all of the n plus n read operations, right? They're sort of m like original read operations that like the memory checking verifier really cares about. Those are the ones like the verifier wanted to issue, and then n final ones from the final pass that the modification 3 has the verifier make over memory. Okay. Yeah, so just like yeah, R consists of all tuples corresponding to all read operations of the memory checking verifier. Okay, does anyone want to ask a question about that definition? Okay. W consists of the same thing, corresponding to all write operations. Okay, and that might be a little confusing. Well, let me explain. So the first n entries of W, so W1 to Wn, they're going to be the tuples initializing memory. So like Wi will equal cell I, value T of I, and count 0 for I equals 1 to n. So so the first n write operations initialize memory. Okay, and then the last m write operations, entries of W, are the tuples that the verifier writes to memory. Okay, so remember, modification 2 says that after each read operation, the verifier writes to memory whatever value the prover returned for the read operation and then the count gets incremented by 1. Whatever count the prover returned on the read operation gets incremented by 1 and then written. Yeah, so those are R and W. Okay, and the key claim is that R and W are permutations of each other. If and only if the prover answers every read request honestly. So that is if and only if for every I from 1 to m, AI equals T of BI, and CI is actually the number of times cell BI was read before the I3 request. Okay, I'm just going to verbally sketch this. It's actually a really nice exercise. I think this is like the only sort of non-trivial claim in the entire like memory checking procedure. Everything else is just fingerprinting. So I encourage you to sort of go offline and think about it yourself a bit. It's not. I don't think it's that hard to see, but I'll just sort of sketch it verbally now. So it's easy to see what happens to R and W when the prover is honest. It's easy to see that direction of the claim, that if the prover is honest, then R and W are indeed permutations of each other. Okay, because at the very start, when at time 0, the values that will have been written into W at that point, we think of like kind of adding tuples to R and W as the verifier in the memory checking procedure does the read operations. So at time zero, W has n entries, one per memory cell, initializing that cell, and R is empty. Okay. And so there's actually this invariant, if the prover's honest, that at all times R is a strict subset of W. W always has like n entries, one per memory cell, that are in W but not in R. And those n entries are exactly like the last tuple sort of written to W. So that is or written to that cell, right, written to that cell. So for each cell I, if the prover's honest, at all times, there's sort of an extra entry in W that's not in R of the form I, comma, TI, comma, like the current count for cell I. Okay, and then at the so W is sort of always staying like these n entries ahead of R, kind of again each of the n entries in W that's not in R is just storing like the kind of the last write operation to that cell. But then the modification 3 has the verifier do these extra n final reads, one per cell, and that's what makes R finally catch up to W, and hence R and W are like permutations of each other. Okay, does anyone want to ask a question about that? So that's one direction of this claim. Okay, so the other direction is like you can think about what happens like the very first time the prover lies and like returns like a value count pair for a read operation that's not like the correct one. Okay, so in that case, something gets added to R that's not in W. Okay, and then the verifier immediately goes due to modification 2 and like does add something to W, namely whatever it takes the count that the prover just returned, increments it by 1, and so that thing gets added to W. Okay, and it's not hard to see then that like the kind of the symmetric difference of R and W at that point, it becomes I guess it might be n plus 2. I think, yeah, so you added something to R that was not in W, and I think you added something to W that was not in R. Pretty sure that's right. And so, yeah, so like if the prover's honest, then like at every single step, the symmetric difference is always n. But now this causes the size of the symmetric difference is always n. There's always sort of n things in W that are not in R. And R is always a strict subset of W. But the first time the prover lies, you get something in R that's not in W, and vice versa, and so the symmetric difference grows in size. And then it's not hard to see that like every read write operation cannot actually decrease the size of the symmetric difference other than the final pass over memory, so other than the final n reads, right. So when I'm saying every read write operation, I mean the reads that immediately get followed by a write, so they're not the final pass over memory. So basically, what I'm saying is like if the prover lies even once, then when the final pass over memory begins, the symmetric difference has size at least n plus 2, and then those final n reads, that final pass over memory, can't reduce the symmetric difference by more than n, and hence the symmetric difference is 0. Is greater than 0 even after that final pass is done, and hence R and W can't be permutations of each other. Okay, so there's actually like a small chance what I'm saying is not strictly right, but that's definitely like roughly what's going on. And again, it's a great exercise. Like if you want to make sure you understand this memory checking procedure, I mean, this is really the core of it. Everything else is these fingerprinting techniques that we should be extremely comfortable with by now. And I'll just cover those final details now. Okay, any questions? No one said anything for a long time. Okay. Can someone confirm I haven't like dropped off the call?
I can hear.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, yeah. So now I can finally tell you the checking procedure. So the question just becomes, how can the verifier check that these two vectors R and W are permutations of each other? Okay. Now you might just think, oh, these are two vectors. We want to check if they're permutations of each other. Let's just apply the permutation invariant fingerprinting. Okay, the problem is that each entry of these two vectors is a three tuple, not a single field element. And this permutation checking was to check that like two vectors, just the field elements are permutations of each other. And though, like we do care about ordering within a tuple, right? A tuple cell, comma, cell BI, comma, value AI, comma, count, CI. Like if you reordered BI, AI, and CI or something, like we would care about that. Like cells are not values, values are not counts, so forth. Um, so you can't directly apply permutation invariant fingerprinting. So what we're going to do is we're going to replace each tuple with a Reed-Solomon fingerprint. Okay, that sort of reduces the tuple from a three tuple down to one field element. Okay, and moreover, as long as there aren't any like collisions under the Reed-Solomon fingerprint, meaning two distinct tuples that map to the same Reed-Solomon fingerprint, it'll be the case that the resulting vectors where each tuple gets replaced with its sort of one field element fingerprint are permutations of each other if and only if R and W are permutations of each other. And then we just apply permutation invariant fingerprinting to the resulting, vector of n plus n fingerprints. That's it. So let me just write that out. V picks two random field elements. Let's say gamma and alpha at random. Okay. So it says now let's say let R prime and W prime be the two vectors where you just replace each three tuple in R and W with the Reed-Solomon fingerprint using gamma as like the random field element. So like R prime will, its ith entry will be like gamma. Sorry, I guess it's gamma to the 0 times bi. So this is like the count for the cell index for read operation I plus gamma to the 1 times AI. This is like the value returned for that read operation, and plus gamma squared times CI. This is the count returned. Okay, and WI prime is I guess. It gets a little annoying just to write it out, but it's just taking W and replacing each thing with the Reed-Solomon fingerprint. So remember, like the first n entries of W, so for I equals 1 to n, like the ith right operation is to cell I, so we just would have gamma to the 0 times I. The value written will be so we have gamma times the value written, which is T of I. And then finally, gamma squared times the count written, which is 0. So I can even just, get rid of that since gamma squared times 0 is 0. And then for, the final n entries, we would have, so like, let's say I equals n plus k, where k ranges from 1 up to m, we'd have, I guess, gamma to the 0 times bk plus gamma to the 1 times ak plus gamma squared times ck. Plus one, right? Because the rights increment, the right following the kth read operation takes the counts that to prove a return for that read operation and increments it by 1. Okay, and then this was just a long way of saying that we replace each tuple in R and W with a Reed-Solomon fingerprint, and then V checks whether the permutation invariant fingerprints of R prime and W prime are the same. So whether the product over all entries of R prime, so alpha minus R prime equals the same thing for gamma prime, for W prime. That's it. Okay, and again, like the key claim is R prime and W prime are permutations of each other if and only if R and W are permutations of each other. This is assuming there aren't two tuples whose Reed-Solomon fingerprints are the same. So long as, for each of the tuples in R and W, and there are most n plus n of them in each, you don't get any kind of collision. So let me just say no collisions, and that happens with probability at most something like n plus n squared over field size, something like that. So if your field is big enough, it basically will never happen. Okay, that's it. And it turns out in the memory checking context, it turns out the verifier can compute these two quantities with just storing a couple of field elements. So basically every read operation and write operation involves like a new tuple getting added to R and W, and the verifier just immediately, Reed-Solomon fingerprints both tuples to get R, the associated entry of R prime and W prime, and then, is maintaining like the running product for each of them of, alpha minus the entry of R prime. So really the verifier winds up just storing, just incrementally maintaining these two products. Like that's it. Okay. So again, that's memory checking. I think I actually can cover like basic lasso for you, and since I have 10 minutes left before I have to sign off, and then next week I'll just cover the details of the sparse polynomial commitment, which probably won't take me a full hour. But yeah, maybe if we have an extra 20 minutes or something next week, I can just open the floor to questions if anyone's interested or something like that. Cool. Does anyone want to ask any questions now?
Yeah, so can you directly convert the tuple into a field element and do permutation checking? Like
Convert the tuple into a field element. Well, I mean, this Reed-Solomon fingerprinting, I guess. Oh, I see. You're saying pack it in. You could do that. Let me just think for a second. So in that case, you'd basically be setting, you'd effectively be setting gamma to be like the max value of any of these, AI, BIs, and CIs that you ever see. So that's how you would kind of maintain that, like, AI, BI, and CI don't like bleed into each other, right? So like, so you're sort of interpreting AI, BI, and CI as kind of digits, or what you call limbs in base gamma here. That's exactly what you're doing. But gamma has to be big enough that, like, again, like, the digits don't bleed into each other, which could be used to cause collisions that shouldn't occur. So what in order to do that, I believe you'd have to range check all of these committed values, which is just extra overhead that's like just not really needed. So yes, what you're suggesting would work, but only if you did extra range checks. And in fact, you have this problem that, like, if you're just fundamentally allowing the AIs to be arbitrary field elements, say because like the table itself like contains, if the table contains random field elements or something, then you actually have a problem because even if the prover is honest in that case, the AIs might be arbitrary field elements. And that situation arises in the sparse polynomial commitment scheme that uses this memory checking stuff as kind of a building block. Yeah, to summarize, if you're guaranteed that like the honest like that the memory, if the prover is honest, only contains like small values that are much smaller than the field size. You could do something like that, but you would have to range check all of these things. Um, and if your table actually contains like random field elements, which actually is the case in some crucial applications, you could not do that. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Cool. Other questions? Okay, yeah. So I think in the next few minutes, I mean, we've basically seen basic lasso, I think now, and I think I'm also just repeating like the overview I gave before. But basically, yeah, in an index lookup argument, the prover will, sort of as part of the setup of the problem, have already committed to A and B. A being the values and B being the indices. And now, as like untrusted advice, the prover is also going to commit to the counts, the same counts that the honest memory checking prover would have returned for these read operations. So I guess there are like n plus n of them. And you sort of also think of the table itself as being like an input. And so after the prover has committed to all of these things, A, B, and the counts, let's just call that C. After that, the verifier will randomly choose these random values, gamma and alpha, that are done in like the randomized memory checking procedure, like the two fingerprinting procedures. It's important that when the prover, chooses A, B, and C, it doesn't know what alpha and gamma will be. And like in practice, you would pick them via fiat Shamir. Okay. And then in basic lasso, like all you would do is you would sort of have a circuit that takes all this stuff as input and just, like applies the memory checking verifier's checks. So what that means is it will basically just compute the product of I equals 1 to n plus n of I think alpha minus r prime of I, and check whether it equals. So maybe subtract the 2, and the verifier insists this should be 0. Alpha minus w prime of I. Okay, and yeah, so I'm going to get pretty sketchy here, but basically, all this circuit is doing is computing this giant subtracting alpha from each entry of Ri prime, subtracting alpha from each entry of Wi prime, and then computing these giant products, which the circuit can do just via binary tree of multiplication gates, and you can just apply the GKR protocol to that circuit, and like the prover will be like order n plus n field operations, which is like vastly faster, like 1,000 times faster than like committing to n plus n, then cryptographically committing to n plus n field elements. So it's like a low order cost for the prover. And then at the end of the GKR protocol, like basically the verifier has to evaluate the multilinear extensions of Ri prime and Wi prime. But it turns out Ri prime and Wi prime are like sufficiently simple functions of all this stuff up here, T, A, B, C, alpha, gamma, that, in order for the verifier to evaluate the multilinear extensions of R prime and W prime, it's enough to just evaluate, the multilinear extensions of T twiddle, A twiddle, B twiddle, C twiddle, each at a random point. And like sort of combine the results very quickly to evaluate the multilinear extensions of R prime and W prime at the point the GKR verifier needs to evaluate them at. So that's it. That's lasso in a nutshell. And the cool thing about lasso, which is or basic lasso anyway, is that the only, other than like A and B, which need to be committed just by definition of an index lookup argument, you just sort of can't avoid it. The only thing the prover commits to is C. at least if the table is structured, so that the verifier can get t total of r on its own. And this vector c, it's just counts. So all of its entries are small. Okay, so in like, that is there. It doesn't matter how big a field you work over. These counts are always like integers between 0 and m or something like that. Yeah, 0 and m. And for certain commitment schemes, it's much faster to commit to small field elements than like big field elements. Meaning it doesn't matter how big the field is. If the field elements getting committed are just counts, it's much faster to commit to them than if they were arbitrary field elements. So something like lookup, for example, the prover has to commit to something like 5 times the max of m and n field elements. Here we're reducing 5 times max of m and n down to just m plus n. And that's like a meaningful reduction on its own. But what's more important is that like 3 times max of m and n in lookup of them are random field elements. So whereas for basic lasso, all n plus n of them are small. Okay, so you put these two things together and you really get like a much faster prover. Now, to be clear, if this vector A of lookups, if the table itself, contains values that are huge, there's no avoiding, by definition of the lookup argument, the prover as like sort of part of the problem, like, formulation has to commit to that vector, which might have large values. And that, that would turn into the bottleneck if these values are really big. But like a lot of lookup tables that are important, and especially all the ones arising in this Jolt work that I'm working on now and hopefully finishing up soon, in Jolt, like all of these values would also be small. So not just the counts are small, but the table values are small too. And I think this, so we are reducing the number of committed values like meaningfully. But where things really seem to get significantly better is because all of the committed values are small, and if you're using elliptic curve based commitment schemes, that really speeds them up. Okay, I gotta go. I should have stopped a couple minutes early to leave open the possibility of questions. If someone has something that'll take like 30 seconds, please go ahead. Otherwise, we'll just take the questions asynchronously or next week, since I do plan to have this group meet next week for an hour. But otherwise, thank you so much. I hope this made sense, and we'll finish seeing the sparse polynomial commitments next week. And yeah, question? All right. Well, thanks again. Again, if you do have a question, like just put it in the chat and I'll answer it within the next 30 minutes. And otherwise, I'll see you next week. Thanks so much.